So this is unfortunately our last class, and as you know, I have decided to devote these last two classes to the general ideas underlying the programmatic arguments about progressive alternatives that have been the main object of the course. Yesterday, ideas about structure and structural alternatives and structural discontinuity in history. And today, in addition to completing and continuing the discussion of those ideas, ideas about the direction, the ideal, the normative presuppositions of the programmatic argument. So we didn't have a chance to have a proper extended conversation about the structural ideas last week. And let me then begin the class by recalling to you the main points. So I began with an explanation of why it is or how it is that we have come to our present predicament of not having a reliable way of thinking and talking about structural change and structural alternatives. On the one hand, we have the legacy of classical European social theory, and especially of Marxism, which very definitely had not only an interest, but a focus on the problem of structure and structural alternatives. And moreover, in that tradition of classical European social theory and Marxism, a revolutionary insight that the structures of society are made and imagined, that they are our creations, and that therefore we can have of them a unique and intimate kind of knowledge, unlike the knowledge that we have of natural phenomena. But the significance of this idea, I argued last week, was circumscribed and to some extent even undermined by a series of deterministic illusions. I call them the illusions of false necessity. That there is a closed list of alternative regimes. Regime is a different word for structure. That each of these regimes is an indivisible system, all of the parts of which stand or fall together, from which there results a binary view of politics, that politics is either the reformist management of a regime or the revolutionary substitution of one regime by another. And that there are laws, historical laws, governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible regimes in history. All of those ideas, the ideas summarized in these three illusions of false necessity, have become literally unbelievable. But the vocabulary that is anchored in those ideas continues to be used as if nothing had happened. And that is in itself a source of immense confusion in the contemporary discussions, not only of social theory, but also of practical politics. On the other hand, there is contemporary social science, which has disposed of the illusions of false necessity only by suppressing the imperative of structural vision altogether. But each of the contemporary social sciences has done it in a different way. Each has, in its own unique way, severed the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. And I then spent some time discussing the particular way in which the most influential of these social sciences, and in some way the best organized, the most imitated, economics has done that. Distinguishing three kinds of economics, all developed under the aegis, under the shadow of the marginalist economic theory of the 19th century. Pure economics, fundamentalist economics, and what I called equivocating economics. Now, I then, in the second part of the discussion last week, sketched a proto-social theory, a view of structure. Not a social theory, but some of the elements of a way of thinking about structure on which the programmatic arguments that I developed during the semester, in fact, relied. And I remind you of some of those elements. So first, there's the identification of a structure, a formative context of social life, a regime. It shapes the surface routines and conflicts of a society. The idea is that in any historical circumstance, in any particular society, there is a set of basic institutional arrangements and of the ideological assumptions associated with them. And these arrangements and assumptions shape the recurrent moves and conflicts of that society, particularly the moves and the conflicts that have to do with the way in which we create the future out of the materials of the present, deploying the resources of political power, economic capital, and cultural authority. So, how do we know that a structural change has taken place? We know that it has taken place because some of these routines change. For example, Keynesianism in the 20th century, which represented part of the intellectual backdrop to the break with the gold standard that had come from the 19th century, allowed the state to have a greater room for maneuver in fiscal and monetary policy, because it was no longer tied to the metallic base of money. On the other hand, it did not allow the state to acquire decisive influence over the investment decision. So it was a reform, a change in the regime, which gave shape to the business cycle or the political business cycle as it came to exist in the second half of the 20th century. The characteristic form of structural change is not systemic change, the substitution of a whole indivisible regime by another one, capitalism by socialism, as in the Marxist categories. The characteristic form of structural change is what you could call radical or revolutionary change. The piecemeal substitution of one of the elements of a regime, change that is fragmentary and localized, but nevertheless structural. Every such structural change may be an excuse or an opportunity to avoid further change, but it may also be a step toward more changes in a particular direction. Fragmentary change persisting in a certain direction under the aegis of a certain conception can become even revolutionary in its impact, in its consequence. So those are ideas about the meaning and the identification of structural change. How do we know it? We know it by its effects. The second set of ideas, then, is to distinguish a structure or a regime from a system. It's not an indivisible system. Its different parts do reinforce one another, but they are not inseparable or indivisible. And when they change, they characteristically change step by step and part by part. Under the influence of these ideas of classical social theory, and especially Marxism, we falsely associate gradual and piecemeal change with superficial change. And we imagine that profound change, decisive change, must be systemic. But this association of gradualism or fragmentary change with shallowness and radical change with totality is unjustified on the argument that I presented. Now, one further important characteristic of these structures or regimes is the variability of what you could call their entrenchment. The social structures or the social regimes, unlike natural phenomena, do not either exist or not exist. They can be established in a form that immunizes them against challenge and change. And in that way, we can say that they entrench themselves. And they attract a false halo of naturalness and necessity. Or, in the other direction, they can be organized in a form that facilitates their own revision in the light of experience. They can lay themselves open to challenge and change. They can be disentrenched. And this particular form of variation in the nature of regimes and of structures has particular practical importance. Each faction of the liberals and socialists of the 19th century had an institutional dogma. And they said, in effect, the faction, embrace this dogma, embrace this plan of institutional change, and you will be both rich and free. Assuming that there is a pre-established harmony or a natural convergence between the institutional conditions for the achievement of our material interests in the development of the productive forces of society and the achievement of our moral interests in the emancipation of social life from any form of entrenched social division and hierarchy. And I remarked last week that we are tempted now to embrace the opposite but equally dogmatic view that there is a tragic contradiction between the institutional conditions for the development of our material interests and the institutional conditions for the development of our moral interests. But it seems that we have better reason to treat the issue experimentally and empirically, and to say or to hope that there is some subset of the institutional requirements for the achievement of our material interests that also serves the pursuit of our moral interests, and some subset of the institutional requirements for the achievement of our moral interests that serves the development of our material interests. That is, there is some zone of possible intersection between the institutional conditions for the development of these two classes of interests. And a characteristic of the arrangements and assumptions in that zone of intersection is precisely the one I mentioned, that they be disentrenched, that they create institutions, especially economic or political institutions, that lay themselves open to revision, to change, to improvement in the light of experience, that they be corrigible. And many of the institutional alternatives that I discussed during the semester, the institutions of a knowledge economy for the many, or the institutions of a high-energy democracy, have precisely that characteristic. They are institutions that serve the discovery of the way along the way. They have this experimental characteristic, this characteristic of disentrenchment and enhanced corrigibility. And you could say the same even of the form of education that I described, that it is the education of people who, as a result of this education, are able to participate in the social world without surrendering to it. And to be, in some sense, insiders and outsiders at the same time. Now, finally, there is another set of attributes of a structure or a regime that deserves attention. And that has to do with the relation between the structure and the functional advantages that it makes possible. This is an idea that played a very important role in Marx's theory of society and history. In Marx's theory of society and history, there is a one-to-one relation between a regime and the particular level of development of the material forces of society, its forces of production, that regime makes possible. A one-to-one relation between the functional advantage and its institutional presuppositions. I want to say that, on the contrary, what is characteristically the case is that any particular functional advantage, for example, a certain level of the development of the productive forces of society, can always have alternative institutional foundations, and that there is not this one-to-one relation. So, the evolution of the structures in history is made with the contingent materials produced by many loosely connected sequences of practical and visionary conflict in history. They're not chosen from some imaginary laboratory or warehouse of historical options. They're chosen from the available, visible, accessible options. And they don't have to be better than any possible organization. They only have to be better than the immediately available alternatives. Those are all the elements that together form the rudiments of a way of thinking about structure, what I claim we generally lack as the result of this history that I described, the history of classical social theory, followed by the campaign that contemporary social science has conducted against structural vision. Now, all of these ideas about structure inform not just the development of institutional alternatives, like the institutional alternatives that have been the main subject of the argument in the course of the semester. They also inform our ideas about agency, about the relation of those alternatives to the social and political alliances that their implementation requires. And so in the final part of class last week, then, I turned to this discussion of agency. And I stated three propositions. The first I called the correspondence thesis. The correspondence thesis is that any idea about alternatives can always be stated in two equivalent registers. It can be stated as a project for the creation of institutional alternatives, of institutional changes, and the ideological assumptions associated with them. And it can be stated as a proposal for a certain kind of coalition, for the creation of a constituency. Every powerful project, every powerful transformative project builds its own constituency. It doesn't just rely on some antecedent constituency. But of course, in building its own constituency, it has to begin, at least, with the way in which the different groups already understand their own identities and interests. The second proposition I called the asymmetry thesis. And the asymmetry thesis states that there is an asymmetrical relation between social alliances, alliances among classes or groups, and political alliances, alliances among forces defined by their programmatic commitments. A political alliance, in the sense in which I'm using it, does not presuppose a social coalition. It has the construction of a social coalition as its goal. Whereas a social coalition does presuppose a political coalition. Now, already this is quite different from the Marxist view of the relation between class alliances and political alliances. And the significance of the difference from the Marxist view comes out in the third proposition, the one of greatest practical significance, which I call the duality thesis. The duality thesis is that there are always two sets of ways of defining and defending a group interest or a class interest. There is one way that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and there is another way that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. And I exemplified that difference with respect to the most important problem of agency in the history of modern progressive politics, which is the definition of the interests of what has been the core historical constituency of the left parties. The organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, and especially in what we call Fordist mass production industry. How are we to define today what their interest is? On the institutionally conservative and socially exclusive view, their interest is to dig themselves in to their present niche in the division of labor and to defend their jobs and their industries against all the threats that they immediately face. Even if that means only buying a few more years of afterlife for them through a series of defensive or negative measures like restraints on subcontracting and on plant closures. And this institutionally conservative approach to the understanding of their interests is connected with its socially exclusive character. The tendency of this approach is to see the groups that are closest in social and economic space to this organized, relatively privileged labor force as the enemy. The small business class, the foreign workers, the temporary workers, and so forth. But there is, I argued, always another way of defining and defending the class interest that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. It says, to take this particular example, this form of production has no future. It's a sinking ship. It has a future only if we convert it into another form of production, and specifically, in this case, into an instance of a more inclusive knowledge economy. In that project of the enhancement of the quality and the character of the productive apparatus, the groups that we used to think of as the enemy, we have to begin to think of as our allies in this process of conversion of one practice of production into another. So all these elements of the idea of agency that I've just summarized under these three propositions are the alternative to a view that says we don't have to have a project. And indeed, we can't have a project because history has a project for us, as in the original form of Marxism under the strictest version of the illusions of false necessity. If we are to have a project, it's not enough to imagine, to formulate institutional alternatives, even if we formulate them not as blueprints, but as successions, as sequences. It is also necessary to have a way and a practice of dealing with the problem of agency. And I've just summarized the general characteristics of that way of thinking about agency. Otherwise, the problem of agency becomes an enigma with no solution. After all, the world, the social world, is always organized to reproduce itself. And the agents who exist always begin with an understanding of their identities and of their interests that would serve this reproduction of the established social world. We could then never understand how one social world turns into another, and yet it does. So this is an enigma that must have a solution, whether or not the solution is the particular one that I have just outlined. Now that's all I wanted to say by way of retaking last week's discussion. And I then ask you for your comments or questions about these ideas. Yes? Yes? You. Yes.
When you said that structural change happens in a piecemeal and localized way,
Yes.
what convinced you that that was true?
I think going back to the original remark about the identification of structural change and when it happens. So how do we know there has been a structural change? We know because one of these recurrent moves in society has shifted, especially the moves by which, as I said, we create the future within the present. So, for example, the business cycle or the political business cycle as it exists in the rich North Atlantic countries, which there are moments of boom and bust, of prosperity and recession, and the recessions have certain characteristics. Those are the product of a transformation that took place. The political business cycle didn't exist in that form under the gold standard. It existed in the space created by the Keynesian reformation that accompanied the social democratic or social liberal settlement. So then the state acquired the power to manage the economy counter-cyclically through fiscal and monetary policy, but it did not acquire the power to influence the investment decision decisively. So there's a certain space. Something happened and something didn't happen. And that's a revolutionary reform. Now, it's a revolutionary reform that can then serve as the initial steps for further possible reforms or not. And this is, I think, one of the ambiguous characteristics of political experience, that the significance of something in politics always depends on its sequel. So it always depends on what happens next. It's what happens next that then retrospectively determines the meaning of the earlier event. Was it just a pretext not to do further change, or was it a step toward further change? This is this permanent ambiguity in political experience. I think this is quite different from the Marxist narrative, because in the Marxist narrative we have this idea that there is a predetermined succession of the regimes. Marx called them the modes of production. And the fundamental agents in this scheme have their role, their words already played out for them. And they can't deviate too much from the historical script. The price for deviation is political defeat. If they start to fantasize that there's this alternative or that alternative, or they could do this or could do that, history will teach them otherwise. They'll break their head against the wall. That's the lesson in Marxism. So, in a developed alternative to that Marxist view, we do have to have a way of thinking not just about possibility, but also about constraint. But it has to be a way of thinking about constraint that maintains possibility, the possibility of the creation of alternatives. So we can relate that to a concept that I have referred to from time to time during the semester, which is the idea of the path of least resistance. So there's a set of innovations in the world, and they are characteristically adopted in the form that minimizes their disruptive impact. That is, their disruptive impact on the ruling interests and the established preconceptions. That's what I'm calling the path of least resistance. So, for example, the insular knowledge economy, the knowledge economy in the insular and relatively superficial and perverse form in which it now exists, is a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. So the claim that I'm making, now to translate the duality thesis into an equivalent vocabulary, is that there is always an alternative to the path of least resistance. Because what is characteristically the case is that the path of least resistance is the one that is easiest to implement by definition, because it's the one that is least disruptive of the established ways of understanding interests and preconceptions about society. But it also characteristically shortchanges the functional advantages of the alternatives. In this case, the functional advantages of a knowledge economy for the many. A knowledge economy for the many is functionally superior to a knowledge economy for the few, because it not only is it less productive of inequality, because it attenuates the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, but it ignites economic growth, because it affords, it gives a much wider social base access to the most advanced practice of production. So the enemies of the path of least resistance, who would be the progressives in this story, have this on their side. What they have on their side is that their cause, in this case the cause of a knowledge economy for the many, is superior in the register of equality or inequality and in the register of economic growth, although more difficult to implement. And then, of course, we have a series of problems. So the path of least resistance is the one that is most accessible given the biographical horizon of the leaders of the progressive parties and of the trade unions. So there's what the economists would call a principal agent problem, because if we come with our duality thesis, or our thesis about industrial conversion, the conversion of the Rust Belt industry into an instance of the knowledge economy for the many, the union leader or the leader of the Progressive Party can say, you want me to jeopardize my relation to my core constituency, the organized labor force headquartered in these jobs that are about to disappear. You want me to jeopardize my relation to that constituency before I have another constituency, and I'll be left with nothing. So it may theoretically be true that this project here has no future, because it's just going to continue to decline. But by the time that becomes manifest, I'll be dead. So that's what I'm calling the principal agent problem. And a deeper version of that problem is this, that you could say the alternative economic and political institutions that we would want would be institutions with this greater attribute of disentrenchment, making themselves open to revision, and therefore depending less on crisis as the enabling condition of change. But by an apparent paradox, the establishment of institutions that depend less on crisis itself seems to require crisis. So how do we break that vicious circle? And we might think one of the ways in which we break that vicious circle is by the use of the political imagination. So the task of the imagination on this view is to do the work of crisis without crisis. But imagination is not enough. So we have to find a way to meet people where they are, on their own understanding of their interests. And so what are the intermediate steps by which they would get from here to there? And it was in this regard that last week and several times during the semester, I've emphasized the petty bourgeois horizon of the majority of humanity. So a large part of humanity, even when it is not objectively part of the small business class, subjectively has the aspirations of the small business class, much more than the aspirations of the proletariat in leftist theory. What it aspires to is a modest prosperity and independence. And the default form for the achievement of that aspiration, I said, is traditional, isolated, archaic, regressive family business. A small plot of land, a store, a little business. That's what everyone wants. Hundreds of millions of people or billions of people in the world. And the attitude of the left in the last 150 years has been militantly antipathetic to that aspiration. So that's one of the things that has set the progressives in contradiction to the desires of the majority of humanity. They would, on this view that I'm stating, have to find a way to meet that aspiration and to create a menu of economic options that would satisfy this desire for modest prosperity and independence by means other than just the traditional, isolated, regressive family business. Here are other ways to do that. And that relates, for example, to the discussion we had about labor and capital. And the conditions under which we could gradually make feasible the prevalence of self-employment and cooperation over economically dependent wage labor as the predominant form of free work. We could only do that if we accomplished what the 19th century liberals and socialists failed to accomplish, which was to reconcile this idea of free work with the relentless imperative of economies of scale in a modern economy. So you can see how all of these discussions about alternatives and about agency in different ways relate to this problem of what's feasible and what's utopian, with which we began. That's how I began the course. Remember, with that dilemma of the person trying to argue programmatically today anywhere in the world. I propose something that's distant, you say it's utopian. I propose something that's close, you say that's trivial. Everything is made to seem either trivial or utopian. And then the first answer to that is the claim that it's not about blueprints, it's about successions. And then we deepen that answer when we come to realize that part of the way in which we got into this dilemma was because we began to lack a way of thinking and talking about structural change. And as a result, we fall back on a surrogate conception of political realism, which is that something is realistic if it approximates what already exists. And that's not an intellectual solution. That's just a declaration that we've lost our way intellectually. So Those are the ideas. And I think it's obvious what's so difficult, which is it would be necessary. We couldn't do this as we've done this here in this semester of 12 meetings in a classroom and so forth. This takes many, many hours and deep practical engagement, but at the same time, it's necessary to soar philosophically in social theory. And who's going to do that? So it's kind of hopeless if you think of it in that way, and yet we have to find a way to do it. So that's the problem. Stated in a different form. More comments, questions? Now there's a second set of ideas, basic ideas in the course about human nature and the ideal. And so let me begin from a point of some remove with respect to a question which hasn't come up directly in the semester, but is always haunting social theory. And that's the question is, what are the presuppositions about human nature? To what extent does a social theory and a programmatic argument, like the programmatic arguments I've rehearsed here, rely on some idea of human nature? And so I want to take a minimalist position with respect to this problem. So on the one hand, we're not justified in having an essentialist conception of human nature. By an essentialist conception, I mean a conception that traces a clear-cut distinction between a permanent and universal core of human nature and a variable periphery. So this is the core, this is what we're always like, this will never change. And then that becomes, in some forms of social theory, an important presupposition of the social theory. So, for example, that's how John Stuart Mill thought of social theory. It was like a pyramid or an inverse pyramid, and the fulcrum then was this idea of human nature. The problem with such an essentialist conception of human nature is that what we put into the constant, what we define as the constant, will always have to be so thin that in fact it has no substance. The only way in which we can uphold this claim of universality is by making what we describe as universal insignificant, ambiguous, diaphanous. Because what happens is that when a form of social life changes, a form of culture, a way of organizing society, everything changes to some extent. There's no part of our experience that you could say is not on the line in our historical experience. For example, the way in which we experience a supposedly private passion, like jealousy, changes from one culture to another, or from one form of society to another. So we can't say that there's any part of our experience which remains immune and aloof to the roller coaster of our historical experience. Everything is on the line in history. And this is related to the polemic against the liberal idea of neutrality. the idea in classical liberal political theory that the order of right should be and can be neutral among different sectarian visions of the good. I said, there is no such neutrality. And the claim of neutrality serves its opposite, because it allows the vision that is called neutral to be entrenched against challenge and change. Every institutional order tilts the scales of human experience and encourages some forms of experience and discourages others. So then I say the idea of neutrality nevertheless has a kinship, is illegitimate, but it has a kinship to something that is legitimate and indeed indispensable, which is the idea that a form of social life should be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and it should be corrigible. So contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. So all of that is, I'm claiming, in this minimalist view. On the other hand, it's also not true that we are like a plastic clay that can be reshaped at will. So this is a problem with many revolutionary ideas of the past, that they presuppose some so-called regeneration of human nature. A new man, a new woman would arise. We don't have that freedom to remake ourselves instantly and at will. We're not like this plastic clay. We do change, and everything in us changes. There's no simple division between the constant and the variable, but we change only at the margin and in ways that we don't fully control. So the dependence of a programmatic proposal on some supposition of a radical change in the way we are is a fatal objection to it. If its stability depends on some radical change in what we're like, then that's a reason to repudiate it. So what is it that results from these two sets of claims that I've just made? The ones that say there's no simple division between the constant and the variable, and the ones that say, nevertheless, we're not a plastic clay. What results is an absolutely minimalist, empirical view of human nature. What is human nature? What is the idea of human nature that we must accept in an argument like this one? It's very simple. Human nature is what we are like now. That's all that human nature is. What we are like now, in a particular society, today, in the moment. And we have to assume that what we are like now is going to change, and that every transformative project is, among other things, a project to change it in a particular direction. But it's only going to change at the margin, a little bit. We're going to steer ourselves in one direction rather than another direction. And we will be tomorrow a little different from what we are today. That seems to me the best accommodation of these contrasting problems or assumptions about human nature that we can expect to have. Now, nevertheless, programmatic arguments about alternatives, do involve a conception of who we are. And it's not a conception that is in contradiction to what I've just stated. It's not saying we'll become this other thing, but now we're something different. It's saying this is what we are like now. And one of the basic attributes of the conception on which these programmatic arguments of the Course have relied is the following. It's the idea that we are shaped by context, we are shaped by these regimes, these indivisible regimes that change piecemeal, part by part, step by step. But there is always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. We spill over. So I'm using this heavy theological, philosophical language that comes from the tradition of Western philosophy and theology. But we could demythologize it or secularize it in some way by saying we have this quality of excess, of surfeit over structure. We spill over the structures that we inhabit. There's more in us than there is in them. And this is the very important assumption or claim about human nature animating, I think, all of the programmatic arguments that I've developed. And the spirit of this claim or of this idea can be clarified by contrast to Hegel's narrative, to the Hegelian idea, especially in the phenomenology of spirit. So a simple characterization of Hegel's argument in the phenomenology of spirit is there was an early moment in the evolution of spirit, of humanity, in which we had an untroubled identification with the practices of society. We then had no subjectivity. We were the puppets of this transparent social medium. It inhabited us and we identified with it, experiencing no contradiction. Then there's a long detour. I'm telling the Hegelian story. There's a long detour in the history of humanity in which subjectivity develops. And we experience then contradiction with the practices of society and contradiction within subjectivity among our ideals. And this is the history of what Hegel calls estrangement or alienation. We experience subjugation, disunion, coldness. That's the long history of humanity of estrangement, which Hegel narrates in a way that makes the history of spirit and its conquest of freedom seem to be inseparable from the forms that this conquest took in the history of the West, and especially in European history. And then there's a final moment in which we will at last be at home in the world. We will have established the institutions that allow us to have subjectivity, to experience our subjective freedom without undergoing any sense of contradiction of that subjectivity with the social practices and institutions. We will then be both subjective and social beings, having found our home in the world. Now, the view that I've just stated is in contradiction with each of the three elements of this Hegelian narrative. So first, there was never a moment when we had an untroubled identification with the practices of society. We were always homeless. We always experienced trouble and contradiction and conflict. Even before there were states and elaborate social hierarchies. Second, it is not true that the stages of estrangement and of the overcoming of estrangement that are identified with these canonical moments of European history have universal significance for all humanity. They're just one version of this detour. And third, we'll never be at home. There isn't a future in which we will finally resolve all the contradictions and experience a complete identification of subjectivity with society. We'll always be homeless and we'll always be in trouble. So I haven't given any arguments for this other view. I've just stated to clarify the contrast between the view I just suggested as being presupposed by the argument and the Hegelian narrative. It's just a way to restate the difference. So nothing in the programmatic arguments that I presented depends on this view of final reconciliation. So there's the possibility of progression, but the possibility of a progression is not to be confused with either the necessity of the progression or its definitive character. Neither one nor the other. Now give me just 1 minute and I'll be back and we'll finish the argument.
No way.
I need it for
That's how I'm approaching it. Like, dive into the pool.
Those people will automatically.
through 2 courses, how big is the debt? So how much can you get the debt? What is Chinese history?
So much online.
Oh, is it on? I don't really get the stuff.
He has all his writings. Same work. All his writings. Almost all his writings.
Oh, he does? Oh, that's good.
He speaks like his books, so like Jennifer.
Yeah.
And he speaks like how he writes.
That's what I'm
So would someone like to comment on this contrast with the Hegelian view? Is it clear at least? Yes.
I guess I just have a question about the idea of like marginal changes in human nature.
Yes.
Do you have an example of some sort of like societal organizational change that like historically like led to some kind of like marginal change in? Is there an example of that we can look to?
Well, you mean in what we're like. So take this problem, which I call the problem of coldness. And, this has a whole history in social theory associated with Max Weber's concepts of charisma and rationalization and so forth. Also Sigmund Freud and the idea of cathexis and decathexis. So the idea is the formula of social life, of the personal encounter, in many human societies in the past was that the typical social relation combined exchange, power, and affect or allegiance. So you could describe the formula of social life in many or most of the societies in human history as the sentimentalization of unequal exchange between bosses and underlings, men and women, parents and children, and so forth. And this was, of course, viewed as a denial, a suppression of human freedom. So then come the liberal societies. And the liberal societies denounce this equivocal mixture of exchange, power, and allegiance, and they separate them. So power is in politics, supposedly. Exchange is in the market. And allegiance or affect is in the family. Separated into separate spheres. So this is a change. And the change is associated with a kind of coldness. So Schopenhauer, in The World as Will and Representation, describes our situation. He says, we're like porcupines in the dark, cold night. They huddle together and to warm themselves, and when they huddle together, they prick one another with their needles, their spines. And then they move apart. And they come closer and further, uncomfortably, until they settle into a kind of uncomfortable middle distance. So that's society after the revolution. The revolution is what breaks this formula of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. And you know, Talleyrand said, those who have not lived before the revolution do not know the sweetness of life. So this is contrasting life in the patriarchal, hierarchical society that confused exchange, power, and allegiance with life afterwards. So afterwards, what is it like? The best you can hope for is a cheerful, impersonal friendliness. So there, that's a change in humanity. So now we think to be free, we have to become cold. But is it true? Do we have to become cold in order to be free? Or is there a way in which we can be both free and warm? If we can't do it by, it can't be that personal love, which depends on intimacy, will radiate into life among strangers. But it might be by another means. For example, one of the sources of warmth might be imagination. And if our political and economic institutions embody the fire of imagination, because there's constant transformation, there's experimentalism, then that might be another way to be both free and warm. So the institutional is connected with the emotional in some complicated way. Now, we don't have a vocabulary in which to deal with that kind of issue. So the problem that I just described as the problem of coldness is not a category of social theory. Unlike the other problems of subjugation, of disunion that are. But there is this relation between the institutional and the subjective. And in changing society in a certain direction, we change what we're like. That's what I said is the residual definition of human nature, what we are like now. So now we're cold. And we have this cheerful, impersonal friendliness, which is the maximum degree of warmth that we allow one another in life among strangers. But does it have to be that way? It wasn't that way before. What other institutional changes might change our subjective experience and make us different? Huh? So I think those are all examples of this idea that everything about us is on the line in historical experience. There's no part of us that we can say, no, that's permanent. There's nothing permanent. Not to be confused with the idea that therefore we're like this plastic clay and we can reshape ourselves freely. We can't do that either. Yes?
But I guess I'm confused because if we're in a state of like almost uncomfortable permanence, like you mentioned with the
porcupines. Yes.
Then does it not take some sort of event of crisis to warrant us moving and recalibrating that again?
Well, I dealt with an issue at a high level of abstraction, a very fundamental issue about our experience, to say that is susceptible to transformation. So, and I'm presenting in very general terms this hypothesis, that there is a source of warmth, a potential source of warmth different from love or affect, which I called imagination. And if the political or economic institutions are in some way the institutional embodiment of the imagination, then that might be another kind of warmth. It would be different from the warmth that Talleyrand referred to as characterizing life before the imagination, but it wouldn't be like the situation of the porcupines. So these experiments with the organization of society are ultimately also experiments with our subjective experience. That's really the substance of the of the claim that I'm making. Successful, unsuccessful, who knows? But we're all on the line, is the point. When we change in a particular direction, everything about us can change. And even the most recondite, esoteric, hermetic parts of our subjective experience can also change. Now, let's go back to, in order to develop further this question of what's the ideal element in the argument? What's the normative presupposition? We have the presuppositions about structure, which I've just summarized, but there are also the normative presuppositions of the argument about the direction. And to that end, it may be useful to go back to an argument I made very early in the course about how we ought to rethink the contrast between the right and the left. And I said, the conventional contrast is shallow equality against shallow freedom. Who's the left? The left are the ones who prioritize equality against the background of the established institutions. The right are the ones who prioritize freedom against the background of the same institutions. So the shallowness of the shallow equality of shallow freedom has to do with the acceptance of the institutional presuppositions. And then I made the observation that if we add the egalitarian profession of faith to the institutional conservatism or skepticism that characterizes the institutionally conservative social democrats and social liberals of today or of the 20th century, the pragmatic residue of that sum is the justification of compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. And that's the world of the Rawlsian theory of justice and the theories of distributive justice. They seem to be radical, but it all ends up as a justification of a little bit more of social entitlements or corrective redistribution. And then I suggested an alternative view of the division between right and left. And there are two elements in that alternative view. So I said, the aim of the progressives is not deep equality. It's not a radical equality of outcome or circumstance. No one ever wanted that. Like the mythical Sparta, the mythical Roman Republic in which everyone is poor and austere and the same, and life is impoverished. The aim is deep freedom. So what then distinguishes on this transformed view the right and the left? So first, a difference in the attitude to the established institutions. The established form of democratic politics, of the market order, of independent civil society. The conservatives, the right, are the ones who pursue their political projects within the unsurpassable horizon of the established institutional framework. They accept the inherited institutional framework as their world. And they say, we're going to humanize it. For example, if they're leftists, we'll humanize it. We'll make it less savage, but we'll accept it. And who then are the left? The left are the ones who refuse to accept the established institutional framework as the horizon. And they pursue their projects beyond this horizon. So, of course, on this definition of the division between right and left, almost all the contemporary leftists are rightists, because those are the institutionally conservative social democrats who accept the established institutional framework, attenuating its inequalities by corrective redistribution. Now, here all the ideas about structure become crucial, because the question is, what does it mean to go beyond the institutional horizon? It's not like the Marxists thought. It's a substitution of one indivisible regime by another, substitution of capitalism by socialism. It's through a succession of fragmentary changes in a particular direction. And given that we are not entitled on this view to entrust our futures to dogmatic institutional blueprints, we want the institutions that we establish to have this experimental character. That is, to lend themselves to revision, to change, to be corrigible in the light of experience, so that we can find the way along the way. And so the alternative theory of structure is the indispensable prerequisite, presupposition of this part of the contrast between right and left. Now then there's the other part. What is this other element that distinguishes the right from the left? That has to do with the direction. So who are the right? Who are the conservatives? The conservatives are the ones who think that it is natural for human life to be small. Individuals, exceptional individuals, can be exceptions to this smallness. The entrepreneurs, the inventors, the heroes, the geniuses, the saints. And occasionally all of humanity can be lifted out of this smallness by the sacrificial devotions of war, for example. So then they have this experience of, they're lifted out of the rut, out of the long littleness of life by emergency. And they're thankful for these emergencies. So that's why I said earlier in the course, I gave you the example. I said in the Second World War, the most terrible war in human history, rates of suicide and depression fell precipitously in all of the belligerent powers. When people were slaughtering one another, they stopped killing themselves. And because, to interpret this in a favorable way, they were able to forget about themselves. They were devoted to this great task, this great struggle that the world was engaged in. And then as soon as universal peace was reestablished, the rates of suicide and depression returned. So the right are those who think that this is the normal situation and it can't be different. The left, the progressives, are the ones who believe that it is not normal for human life to be small and that we can become bigger, but that we become bigger together. In other words, we become bigger together or not at all. And then the struggle against inequality is subsidiary to this ascent. So the ascent of common humanity, of the mass of ordinary men and women, to a life of greater scope, more capability, more intensity, is the true object. That we all rise up together to a higher form of life. We ascend, And we all want to live in such a way that we can die only once. And inequality is then just an incident, because an entrenched inequality corrupts our relations to one another and is incompatible with this shared ascent. So, but the essence of it is not some radical equality of circumstance or outcome. The essence of it is the sharing in our empowerment. Now, what I want to do is I want to add to this otherwise general and abstract conception particular conceptual structure by way of elucidating philosophically this idea of ascent to a higher form of life. And to elucidate it by reference to three contradictory aspects of our self-construction. So, what does it mean for us to be greater and freer? To come more fully into the possession of life? Not on the basis of unique individual talents, but as a shared achievement. So, there are three sets of contradictions in our experience of freedom or empowerment. First of all, in the relation of the self to the other, to the others. You know, Jean-Paul Sartre said, the others are hell. It's the opposition of the other to the self. To be free, we have to be able to connect. Because without connection, no one is anything. Practical connection, emotional connection, cognitive connection. But every connection to the other threatens us with subjugation or loss of personal distinction. So what does it mean to be free? What it means to be free is to be able to connect without being subjugated. And we do have an experience of that, a fragile experience of that, in personal love. But personal love, in addition to being precarious, also thrives only in the sphere of intimacy. So it's not altruism. Altruism is not love. Altruism is given from a distance, from on high. It can involve sacrifice, even the sacrifice of one's own life. But there's no intimate jeopardy. There's no heightening of personal vulnerability as there is in love. Altruism can be universal. There can be altruism towards strangers. But although Christ commanded us to love the stranger, it's hard to love the stranger. There's no real love outside the sphere of intimacy. So then there has to be an equivalent to love among strangers. And the equivalent is cooperation. Cooperation among free and equal individuals. The institutional forms of cooperation are always contestable and imperfect. And so that's the struggle in politics. How will we organize the market? How will we organize democratic politics and so forth? But one of the essential dimensions of freedom, of this empowerment, is this, that we have this experience of being able to connect without being subjugated. And if that can't depend on love, as it can't in life among strangers, it has to depend on cooperative activity. Yes?
If there's nothing essential about human nature, why can there not be, why can there under no circumstances be the kind of intimate love between
Well, I'm not. Well, I think you're changing the meaning of essential here, because what I was saying is, what is human nature empirically or minimally, in the end, residually, is what we are like now, and I take it just as an empirical claim about our experience that love depends on intimate engagement. So, for example, in love, unlike altruism, in love there is an epistemic, there's a cognitive threshold. So the initial problem in love is the imagination of the other, insight into the other. The other has to be recognized for who the other is, he, she, in order to be accepted. There's no cognitive threshold in altruism. We can be generous to someone about whom we know almost nothing. But that's not the characteristic of love. Otherwise, we say love is then just a projection onto the other of some fantasy that we have about ourselves, about something else, about someone else. But love involves insight, imagination, the imagination of the otherness of the other. And we can't have it, or it's hard to have it, of the stranger. So let's say that's one dimension of our freedom. And we need a conception of freedom to elaborate philosophically this idea of our ascent to a higher form of life, coming into the possession of life together. That's the idea. Now, then there's the second element, which is to be free, we have to be able to participate in a particular social world, a social and cultural world. No one can be free in isolation. So to be free, it's not just that we have to be connected to particular individuals through love or through cooperation. We have to be able to engage in a real society or in a real culture and to assume a position within it. But the problem is that every engagement in a particular world may seem to require, as a condition of our engagement, that we surrender to that world. And then we're not free. So then we have a second contradictory condition of our freedom or our self-assertion, that we have to be able to engage without surrendering. We have to be able to engage in a social world in such a way that in engaging it, we continue to resist it. That we're able to challenge it, to change it. And that's also an intrinsic dimension of our freedom, of our self-construction, of our coming into the possession of life. Engagement without surrender, or to change the vocabulary, that with respect to any social world, we be able to be in that world both insiders and outsiders. We are free if we are never just insiders, although we must be insiders, but that we remain outsiders while we are insiders. Then we're free. And of course, a social world may be organized in a way that facilitates or makes more difficult this experience of being insiders and outsiders at the same time. It may say, no, if you engage in me, you must surrender to me. Or it may say, no, you can engage in me without surrendering to me. And that's a higher form. Now, there's a third dimension of these contradictory conditions of self-construction. And the third dimension is the relation of the self, not to others, not to the social world, but to itself. So to be free, we have to form a coherent way of being, a form of the personality. which the Greeks called it character, and they said character is destiny. So we have to develop this way of being, a coherent way of being. Nietzsche, in his philosophy, described this as one of the supreme objects of the individual, to form himself as a work of art, like his whole life, his persona as a work of art, as if he would monumentalize himself. He'd be like a statue that he would carve in stone. So we have to have this coherent way of being. So we can't just be in the situation that Hegel describes as the situation of the adolescent, lost in particularity, going from one thing to another, with no coherence in his life, in his personality. But now suppose we develop this coherent way of being. The coherent way of being may then become a mummy, a carapace, a shell. It may actually be like a physical statue, a monument, which sucks the life out of us. We give it our life. It becomes us. And so then we're not free. So this is the third contradiction, that to be free, we must be able to form this coherent way of being, and simultaneously we must be able to disrupt it. We must be able to rebel against it from within. Because if we can't rebel against it from within, then we begin to die by installments. And what we should want is to die all at once and not in little bits. Not allowing this carapace, this monument, to suck the life from us. So that's, as it were, the third dimension of freedom. And you might say a society could be organized to facilitate this by the way in which it educates people, by the way in which it gives them options to change careers, to change directions in the course of their lives, to allow them to become disruptors of themselves and to be engaged in this ongoing self-reinvention, which is necessary to life. So this is the third element in this contradiction. So that's just by way of elaborating philosophically this conception of shared empowerment, of ascent to a higher form of life. What does it mean? It means our advance in the resolution of these three sets of contradictions that I've just described, which is a political task and a moral task at the same time, because there's a dialectical relation between our moral projects and our political projects. Our political projects take place in historical time. Our moral projects necessarily take place in biographical time, on the dimension, on the span of a human life. Political projects like these alternatives cannot be consummated in a human life. And so one of the roles of our ethical ideas is to serve as a way of compensating for the failure of our political projects. We don't get to choose our place in history. And so our moral projects must somehow make up for the omissions of our political pursuits. So this is a way, this is just one way among many possible ways of explaining, elucidating the normative presuppositions of the argument. The aim is not a radical equality of outcome or circumstance. The aim is our ascent to a higher form of life together, that we become bigger together. And the content of this shared bigness is then the partial resolution of these contradictions that I've just described. never at home in the world, never perfected, never in that final circumstance that Hegel imagines, always homeless, but nevertheless capable of advancing. So there you have it. That's one way of describing the normative presuppositions of the argument and justifying this proposal to reshape our understanding of the division between the right and the left. Comments, questions? Yes.
I might be going back to this, but I guess, a little confused about how you can have a society where individuals cooperate with each other in order to substitute that sense of like intimacy, and how that cooperation in and of itself wouldn't reduce individual agency and freedom.
Well, remember, so the problem that was imagined there in that first contradiction is the problem of subjugation. As soon as there is coordination, there's a basis for the formation of classes, of castes, of hierarchies. How can we avoid that? That's the problem that's presented. And so all the particular ways we can have of avoiding it are flawed. But some are more flawed than others. And so that's then the beginning of this debate. So that's all that's being said there. That we're free if we can connect without being subjugated. And so that relates to everything we've discussed in the course, every single part of it. All of these institutional proposals. They're not about, I think they're fundamentally not about equality, although they have implications for equality and inequality. They're about freedom, and a freedom that we can possess and exercise together, and about becoming bigger together. We don't become bigger unless we can become bigger together, is the idea. So the question that we have to be able to answer is that the question, where are the others? That's in which our empowerment, our bigness is something that we can possess only together. Yes? Contradictions.
Yeah, contradictions within
Self-assertion, self-construction.
yeah, within the self-construction
Of humanity, of our ascent, yes.
I wanted to know how, if at all, you see your view of those contradictions in distinction from the liberal tradition sense, at least Mill said, where it seems like, and this isn't a challenge, I'm sure it's elaboration, but it seems like there's a lot of parallel with Mill, or even Rawls at the end of the theory of justice, on what it is to form, revise, and pursue one's own conception of the good. The idea of social cooperation among free and equal citizens. Right? These are values that, for instance, you seem to hold. And so what I'm wondering is how, if at all, is your view on the ethical side a challenge to
Well, we haven't discussed ethics here, right, in this course. I'm giving another course now, in which this is the subject, called The Conduct of Life in Western and Eastern Philosophy. And actually, my view of the situation there is quite different. So I think that at the end of that there are now two moral visions in contest in the world. There is an ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. And which is especially associated with one of the two great powers in the world, the United States. And there is an ethic of connection and responsibility associated with the other power, China. And I've criticized the canonical, conventional forms of those two ethics, which are precisely the forms that most clearly bear the marks of those particular countries and cultures. And the object of, and the criticism of them brings them much closer together. So the revised versions of those two moral visions are much closer together than the unrevised versions. But when they are criticized in that way, I don't think they are synthesized. They don't become the same. On the contrary, their distinctions stand out all the more clearly. So the outcome of that argument is that there is an enduring duality in our moral consciousness. And behind that duality stand two great functional imperatives of the contemporary societies. The enhancement of personal agency, standing behind the ethic of self-fashioning, and the development of the higher forms of cooperation, standing behind the ethic of connection and responsibility. I think that the institutional program that I've outlined and explored here in this course is broadly compatible with both of those moral visions. So this more or less corresponds to the Rawlsian idea of an overlapping consensus in the political implications of these moral visions. So in their political implications, they can be seen as converging. But in their moral core, they're very different. And so the institutional arrangements of this society could be justified from these two very different moral standpoints. They have different points of departure. For one, the point of departure is the individual. And the individual who, in the end, faces death alone and is embodied in a dying organism. And the other, the point of departure is joint intentionality, the logic of the interpersonal, you and me. There's always the duo, which is at the beginning. And there's a whole set of rich implications for the way we live and for the way we understand life and other that follow from this duality. So I would say, now just a couple of minutes left. I would put this in the context of an idea to which I also referred early on in the course. So for the last 200 or 300 years, the world has been on fire. There's been world revolution. And so there's a revolutionary project, and this revolutionary project has two sides. There's the political side, carried by the doctrines of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. And there is the personalist side, carried especially by Romanticism and the worldwide popular romantic culture, with its message disseminated throughout the world, that the ordinary man and woman is not so ordinary after all, and is divine, that we become more human by becoming more godlike. So this project that I just described is the commanding project in the world. It has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. It continues to command the agenda of humanity. So in that sense, it is very strong. But it is now also simultaneously weak because its defenders, among whom I count myself, no longer know what its next step should be on either the political side or the personal moral side. And of course, if you don't know what should happen, how you can reinvent a project, then it begins to die. So that's the sense in which it's weak. So I see myself or my own life as having fallen in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And I am determined that my ideas and my actions will not be shaped by the biases of this counter-revolutionary interlude, because I want the revolution to continue. But I understand that it can't continue in the form that it had before. That in order to live, in order to continue to burn in the world, it has to be reinvented. And that explains my whole attitude in this enterprise, in this implausible enterprise conducted under such implausible circumstances. Thank you for your patience. It's been delightful for me.
Just